and gentlemen, and welcome to the Jaipur Literature Festival at Jaipur. We are delighted to introduce the session Black Rainbow, How Poetry Healed My Depression. We have Rachel Kelly and Sudhir Kakar, and the session is sponsored by Amity University. We begin the session now.
Okay. I have great pleasure in welcoming Rachel here. Let me introduce her first. So, educated at Oxford University, Rachel Kelly spent 10 years as a journalist at The Times. Rachel gives talks and runs workshops across the country being UK, not India, on the therapeutic value of the arts, and has created 2 poetry applications. Her memoir, Black Swan, on the healing power of the written word was a Sunday Times bestseller, and which would be our focus in today's session. Rachel is an ambassador for SANE and Vice President of the United Response and campaigns to reduce the stigma surrounding mental illness. I must confess that I got Black Swan on PDF. Black Rainbow. just yesterday. And so I skimmed through it. I haven't read it, but sometimes skimming through gives you a greater idea. You engage much greatly with the skimming through than with reading slowly. And my first feeling was that after the Anatomy of Depression, this is by far the best book on the experience of depression. I mean, we have a lot of third-person perspective on how to look at depression, but how does a person experience the depression? This was, I think, a great achievement of Rachel, which of course I'm sure she's going to talk about. And depression, as we know, is an illness which is much more common and causes much more torment and misery than most people realize. But since, as we said, this session is on the poetry rather than depression, I will restrict my remarks to poetry as therapy for depression. Before I just starting remarks is, in Greek mythology, Asclepius, the god of healing, was the son of Apollo, the god of poetry. I don't think we have the same connection with Saraswati in our mythology. Robert Graves, a poet as well as a professor of poetry at Oxford, declares, a well-chosen anthology is a complete dispensary of medicine for more common mental disorders. But I think such prescriptions have to be taken with a grain of salt. If poetry works as a therapy, then perhaps best in the case of depression, where the formula mus melancholiae therapeuticum poesie applies, as it did, for instance, for a while with Sylvia Plath, or for a long time with the Austrian poet Rainer Maria Rilke, who wrote that of his work as being from the beginning a self-treatment. It is also intriguing that, Rachel, that your title, Black Rainbow, it reminded me of a great German poet, Johann Wolfgang Goethe, and who also used the image of the rainbow. This is from a poem of his collection from 1815, says, a delicate poem like a rainbow is inscribed only on a dark field. Thus poetic genius is content in melancholy's element. For Goethe, of course, writing poetry is a therapy for melancholy, insofar as it frees the melancholic from the prison of his own subjectivity, his transcendental homelessness, into the consolations of a poem where the rainbow is a colorful reflection of a higher universal harmony ruling individual lives. And we were talking just a little before it that for me, of course, the main thing when I'm talking with a depressed person or a depressive illness, how to get out of the subjectivity, out of inside into connection with whatever, people, universe, etc. So for Goethe, of course, the rainbow symbolizes is the aesthetic reconciliation of the individual with the universe. The rainbow, as you know, is said to have been created by God after the flood as a reconciliation between heaven and earth. So I will now turn to Rachel, and please.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you for that very kind introduction and very erudite and interesting comments about poetry. Okay, I wanted to say that I'm very thrilled to be here today. It's a very important conversation that I hope we're going to be having. And I want us to have a conversation as a group about the topic of depression, the topic of mental illness, and what we can do for ourselves to stay well and to get better. So what I've found is that though depression is an illness, and something happens and something goes wrong with your brain, like all illnesses, it happens in a context. So just as diabetes happens in a context where we eat too much sugary food, depression happens in a context where either we can create conditions in which our mental health flourishes, or we can create conditions in which our mental health is vulnerable. So what I want to share with you today is some strategies to stay well, to heal yourselves, and poetry will be foremost among them. But I will touch on other strategies, because I think that while poetry has been at the heart of my own recovery, it would be silly to say that other things haven't been important too. So before I start properly, I would like to invite you all to stand up, please. Thank you very much. Now, could you please stay standing, follow instructions, please stay standing if you or a member of your family has experience of mental illness. So that might be depression, or it might be other kinds of mental illness. It might be bulimia, anorexia, bipolar, any experience of mental illness. Please stay standing in the room if that is the case. Okay, thank you very much. So that's around 2/3 of you, maybe a little bit more, have had some experience of mental illness, or someone in your family has had experience of mental illness. Now, I invite you to stay standing if you have felt able, with your family, with your colleagues, in your place of work, to be very open about your experience of mental illness, to stand up, as it were, and to have this conversation as I am doing now. Only stay standing if that is the case, if you've been able to be open about your experience of mental illness. I invite you to be really honest. Okay. Thank you very much. That's just probably around maybe 20 of you in this room who have felt able to be open about your experience. So you may all sit down now. The reason that I start like that is I do think it's very important to acknowledge the stigma that surrounds mental illness, and that we need to have this conversation. And I think one of the reasons that I'm so excited to share with you the poetry and the therapeutic value of poetry is that in defeating stigma, one of the very optimistic and positive ways is to realize that you can recover and you can get better. That's why I'm so excited to stand here today. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to talk for around half an hour, and then we're going to share some poems, which these ladies are kindly going to read. And then we're going to open up the discussion, because I say this is about a conversation, and I really want to hear about your experience of mental illness, your experience of what strategies help and make you better. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to tell you a little bit about what happened to me and how poetry played a part in my recovery. So we rewind to 1997, probably some of you were not born then. But 1997, so back in the UK, we had the Blair landslide election victory. Tony Blair comes to power. And at that time, I'm a reporter. I'm working at the Times newspaper in London, and my husband, who's here today, big part of my recovery, my husband is working is a junior banker. So we're working hard, we have 2 small children, and life is good. It's exciting, it's demanding. I'm quite anxious, I've always been quite anxious. I'm an anxious child, and I'm an anxious adult, but still, life is exciting if busy and stressed. And what happens is, one night, I can't get to sleep. Now, I later learned, when I discovered more about depression, that insomnia is very characteristic of depression. Quick show of hands, anybody here suffer from insomnia? Okay, quite a few of you. So this insomnia was different, because with the insomnia came some very alarming physical symptoms. So what happened was my heart rate speeded up. I felt as if I was going to vomit, like I was going to throw up. And I had this very alarming kind of feeling as if inside my head was being stung by wasps. These worrying thoughts were just going round and round and round. If I don't go to sleep, I can't get up the next morning, I won't be able to go to work, I won't be able to look after my children. If I can't get to work, then we won't be able to pay the bills, etc., etc. These worries were going round and round and round. And it felt like a skater. And every time, the marks and the ice were deepening. And I just couldn't control these very, very worrying thoughts. I later learned that this is very characteristic of depression. They're called catastrophic thoughts, the catastrophic way of thinking. If. So I stayed up all night, and the next morning I thought, okay, right, I'm a sort of together person. I'll refasten activity to its normal time. I'll breakfast at breakfast time. I'll lunch at lunchtime. I'll have dinner at dinner time. And I'll sleep at night time. But unfortunately, the insomnia didn't go away, nor did the alarming physical symptoms. And 3 days later, I found myself in hospital. And actually, I thought I was possibly having a heart attack, because I knew nothing about this anxiety-driven depression. And I said to the doctor, "You've made a mistake. I'm not depressed. I'm busy, I'm stressed, but I'm not depressed." And he said, "Okay, well, I think this is the start of a depressive episode." And so it proved. So the first depressive episode lasted for 6 months. And little by little, I started to get better. I was in hospital. I was in my psychiatric hospital. And little by little, I did recover, and I did get back to the times, and I changed nothing. But in the pattern of depression, I had a second depressive episode. This is very characteristic. Your second depressive episode tends to be much worse than your first one. And so it proved. So the second time I was ill for a year. And when I was first ill and I was lying in my psychiatric hospital, I had my mother in one hand and I had my husband in another hand. And I was suicidal. And the reason I was suicidal was not because I didn't have an exciting and interesting life. I was suicidal because of the physical pain of a depressive episode. So when people say mind and body are linked, I say they're the same thing. A mental illness, it can express itself with these very alarming and very painful physical symptoms. So I was screaming, and I was screaming in agony, and I was saying I want to die. And the reason I wanted to die because I couldn't face the pain. So, as is characteristic, I was treated with very strong drugs, which is the first approach, particularly in the West, to severe depression. So I was basically sedated to try and control the anxiety, and I was given very strong antidepressants. Now, the problem with drugs, for me, and the problem with drugs for a lot of people, is they don't work straight away. Usually, they can take around 6 weeks to start working, and even then they don't work for everybody. So I was in this situation that the drugs weren't working, and I was still screaming and suicidal. And it was at that point that words first spoke to me. And my mother, who has a head richly stocked with poetry and is from a generation who learnt poetry by heart, which is a campaign of mine for more people to learn poetry by heart, which is a skill which we have lost in the UK, she had a head richly stocked. And actually she started repeating a line from the Bible. And many of you will know that the poetry, the Bible is very rich and full of poetry. So she started repeating this line. And what she said was, "My grace is sufficient for thee, my strength is made perfect in weakness." So I was lying on the bed screaming, "I want to die," and she was next to me repeating, "My strength is made perfect in weakness. My strength is made perfect in weakness." And in this extraordinary moment, at the very worst of my depression, this line spoke to me. It was the first stirring of what you might call positive will, when I thought, actually, you know what? Maybe there's some point to this. This very debilitating illness that I'm suffering, which seems utterly pointless, but maybe I will become stronger through this process. So that was the very first time words spoke to me. And in this very, very dark time, a poem spoke to me and my family very, very profoundly. It's going to be the first poem that we're just going to hear a few lines from in a minute. It's by an American poet called Anne Sexton. And actually, I was much too ill to be able to hear a whole poem. One line was plenty, which is another way that I think poetry could be extraordinary, because you may not need a whole verse. One line, a mantra, can be extraordinary. But this Anne Sexton poem is one way in which I think poetry is extraordinary, because it can give us the words to describe something which we can't describe. So if you imagine the scene in our family, is my husband is trying to look after our children and go to work. My mother's looking after me as well. And nobody understands what's going on. We don't know what this thing is called depression. None of us have experienced it, certainly not severe depression. And my husband needs a way to explain to people what's happening. What's happened to Rachel? You know, she was the busy bee, good, busy journalist, mother, and now she's lying on a bed. What's going on? So just going to hear a few lines which just summed up a little bit of what it was like. So I'm going to read the very first one, which is this Anne Sexton poem.
I did not hear the bird sound. They had left. I did not see the speechless clouds. I saw only the little white dish of my faith, shaking in the crater. I kept saying, I have got something to hold on to. People gave me Bibles, crucifixes, a yellow daisy, but I could not touch them. I, who was a house full of power movement, I, who was a defaced altar, I, who wanted to crawl toward God, could not move nor eat bread.
Thank you very much. So that poem describes a kind of total lack of hope and a total lack of any kind of belief, which, despite the fact that I shared with you a line from the Bible, there were big periods of time when I lost any faith. And that description of feeling like a defaced altar, unable to do anything, unable to eat. I could eat no solid food. My whole digestive system was so riddled with anxiety I couldn't digest anything. That description of not being able to eat was so powerful and was so true to my experience. And the other line in that poem, which was such a good description of what was happening to me, was I had to have something to hold on to. So I had this very strong sensation that I was falling, that the bed was falling. And this is why I used to grab hold of my husband and my mother, or a nurse, to hold on to something, So I was electrified that Anne Sexton, this American poet, had had this same experience of feeling the need to have something to hold on to. And equally, this experience of utter loss of any faith. And I think one way poetry is so important is that you can feel less alone. It turns out that there are others who have experienced this and written about it far better than I. So in this process of beginning to get a little bit better, so I'm still in hospital and I'm beginning to recover and I'm taking these very strong drugs, I think the next key moment for me was when I came across a poem by George Herbert. So George Herbert is a 17th century poet, and one of the ways that I was so moved when I came across his work was a feeling again that I was not alone. So he was in the 17th century, but his words spoke to me so vividly across 300-400 years. And when I learnt a little bit more about George Herbert, what I realized is that he would not have been diagnosed with depression at the time, but all his poems are about trying to find a way through a very dark time. So I'm going to share one with you, which is called Love. Because one of the ways that I learnt to get better was to develop a more compassionate and loving and forgiving inner voice. So one of the characteristics of people with depression is they are very critical of themselves. They have very low self-worth. They don't feel good enough. And they keep trying. And they often get in a thought pattern of anxious striving, more. They're not good enough. And that was certainly my case. So I'm going to share this poem with you, which is called Love. And you'll hear that it has two voices in the poem. And one voice is the voice of compassion and forgiveness and gentleness. And the other voice is the voice of the person that feels depressed, that doesn't feel good enough. So this is how it goes. Love bade me welcome. Yet my soul drew back, guilty of dust and sin. Yet quick-eyed love, observing me grow slack from my first entrance in, sweetly questioned if I lacked anything. What? I, the unkind, the unworthy? Lord, I cannot look on thee. Love, smiling, did reply, who made the eyes but I? Truth, Lord, but I have marred them. Let my shame go where it doth to serve. And know you not, says Love, who bore the blame? You must sit and taste my meat. So I did sit and eat. So I think you can hear in miniature in that poem the clashing voices that often happen inside the head of somebody who is very depressed. As I say, the critical, not good enough voice versus the compassionate and loving voice. And the last two lines of that poem again struck me very forcibly. So I did sit and eat, because what I most wanted was I wanted to get better, and I wanted to sit and have a meal with my family. I wanted simple things. So that was the first poem that really spoke to me. And when I was finding out more about George Herbert, I found out that he was dying. And he couldn't decide whether to run or publish any of his poems. Mainly he'd written them as prayers, which is often the case. And he said to his friend, shall I publish these poems? And his friend said, well, yes, I think you should. And he said, well, I'll only publish them. Can you publish them rather when I'm dead? And his phrase was, if they are of use to any poor, dejected soul. So he wrote very deliberately poetry to be of use to a poor, dejected soul. Anyway, I will continue. So one of another ways that poetry made such a difference to me is that one of the characteristics of depression is that we are very much, as Sudhir said, we are very much on an internal story. We lose an ability to connect with nature, with others. And so the next poem that spoke to me a lot is by an American poet called Emily Dickinson. And it's about hope and a small bird as that symbol of hope. And it helped me reconnect with a bigger world. So we're going to hear hope. Thank you.
Hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the soul and sings the tune with the words and never stops at all. And sweetest in the gale is heard, and sore must be the storm that could abash the little bird that kept so many warm. I've heard it in the chillest land and on the strangest sea, yet never in extremity it asked a crumb of me.
Thank you very much. Interestingly, there are a lot of poems about small birds as symbols of hope. And when I was still convalescing and still not well enough to be back at work, I used to go and watch this little robin. And I think there is something magical about the fact that a bird is the only thing, obviously, that can fly. And these words of Emily Dickinson, again, helped me see that we are part of something bigger. And this was a key step to recovery from this very negative interior dialogue. So I'm going to finish with one more poem, which is another key lesson that I learned, which is about a kind of acceptance. And then what I'm going to do in the last sort of 10 minutes or so is I'm just going to tell you a little bit about the evidence that this can actually work, because I think any of you sitting here will think, well, yes, okay, poetry, that helped Rachel, but, does this actually work? Is there any evidence? And the exciting thing is, there is a long history and there is now some really good work on this field of where the arts and mental health meet. But before I do that, this last poem, which is by a Persian mystic some of you may know called Rumi, is about another key element of recovery. So we had the Herbert, which was about developing a compassionate inner voice. We then had the Emily Dickinson, which was about reconnecting with something bigger than ourselves. And then we're going to hear the Rumi, which is about this ability to accept. And that was a big part of me getting better, because when I was fighting and saying, this can't be happening, I must fight this thing, the more I fought, the worse I got. And we know in medicine that acceptance is a key part of recovery in mental illness. So we're just going to hear one more poem, which is this Rumi poem. Can we do that one? Yeah, thank you. Yes, perfect. Thank you very much.
This being human is a guest house. Every morning a new arrival. A joy, a depression, a meanness, some momentary awareness comes as an unexpected visitor. Welcome and entertain them all, even if they are a crowd of sorrows, who violently sweep your house, empty of its furniture. Still treat each guest honorably. He may be clearing you out for some new delight. The dark thought, the shame, the malice, meet them at the door, laughing and inviting them in. Be grateful for whatever comes, because each has been sent as a guide from beyond.
Wonderful. I think we should give a clap for our poetry readers. Thank you. I think you read them beautifully. Okay, so I'm just going to talk for about another 10 minutes or so. So I just wanted to touch on what we know a little bit about the evidence and what we know about why poetry can work. So we touched on it earlier, so Apollo being the god of medicine and the god of poetry. And there's a very, very long tradition through history of people turning to healing words, people turning to poetry as a salvation. So if we go right back to the ancient Egyptians, so when the ancient Egyptians, when something was wrong, they would write a word, a poetic prescription on a piece of papyrus. It would be dissolved in water, and the physician would say, swallow this prescription. And there's something very powerful about that, about having something inside you, knowing something by heart, which is another way, in fact, I use poetry a lot, the requirement to concentrate when you learn by heart, and then you have this amazing resource inside you, always, whenever you need it. So back to the history, we have the ancient Egyptians. Then moving forward, the shamans and sort of ancient healing, always again, healing mantras. As I said, a few lines, it might not be a whole poem, can make a huge difference, a mantra that you repeat. And if we sprawl forward, when Benjamin Franklin set up his first hospital in the 18th century, he used prescriptions, reading and writing, as prescriptions for those who were unwell. And coming on forward in the tradition of analysts and psychotherapy, both Freud and Jung were big believers in the importance of poetry. And in America now, through the 20th century, they set up various associations of poetry therapy, etc., etc. And moving forward to now, so I wanted to tell you a little bit about some of my work now and why, again, it's a very exciting time for the world of those of us that believe in the importance of the arts. Because I wanted to just give you a little bit of an overview about the approaches to mental illness and why poetry now, in my view, is having a real great moment, is that what tends to happen is we get great enthusiasms for what's going to sort out our mental health, and it tends to be a kind of one-size-fits-all. So in the 80s, there was a great excitement about antidepressants and the development of Prozac. And then in a classic pattern, what happened was what they found was that not everybody was sorted by antidepressants, probably around a third straight away, maybe a third after some time, and then a third not at all. So then there's a sort of a bit of a disillusionment, not to mention side effects, which are very, very strong. I myself ballooned to nearly 13 stone when I took strong antidepressants. And then what tended to happen was there's a great excitement about talking therapies. In the UK, the government funded a lot of talking therapies. And again, it's the same pattern. They didn't work for everybody. And then more recently, there's been a great excitement around mindfulness as a strategy. And again, great enthusiasm. Again, quite a lot of success, but again, it doesn't work for everybody. And I think what's happening in the mental health world now is that people are looking for a very nuanced approach. People's mental health is subtle, and it's very not necessarily resolved by a kind of sledgehammer, one approach fits all. This is very, very much my view, and I think the way the arts can play a role in this more holistic approach, which is being adopted quite widely. And I love the fact that poetry, because there's an infinite number of poems,
JLF at South returns for its third edition from the 21st to the 22nd of May. Catch the conversations, debate and dialogue along the banks of the London Thames.
Liverpool University is
Amity across the pond, JLF at Bodo will be back for a second year from the 23rd to 25th September.
To concentrate, to be in the moment, to unpack the meaning and to understand what that poem is about is actually incredibly good.
For the latest information, visit www.jaipurliteraturefestival.org, follow us on Facebook, Twitter and Instagram, or download the Team Arts app.
When you were listening carefully to some of those poems, that required extraordinary concentration, and you may find that actually you would have to go back to those poems to really understand what they meant. Now that, it turns out, is very, very good for your mental health. And as I say, it replicates the sort of brainwave that happens when we're in the moment and concentrating in the flow. In fact, there's a lovely line about, which is by another poet, Alice Thomas, and there's a sort of definition of happiness, and it says, happiness is not about chasing success or...
The annual Jaipur Literature Festival brochure with details on each session, author profiles and photographs. A must-have guide to the festival. This limited edition program is a collector's item and is available for sale at ₹100. Pick up your copy now.
And I'm sure you will get the meteorological collection that my next book, which has just come out in the UK, is called Walking on Sunshine. So I wanted to share that with you. And thank you very much, and thank you for listening. I hope you found something helpful.
I think I have. Thank you very much, Rachel. It was very, very interesting.
Thank you.
I have 3 comments, and maybe you can react to those, and then maybe we can open to the audience also. You ended with happiness, and there are so many definitions of happiness. Mine is not, okay. I said, you mentioned happiness. My favorite definition of happiness is Ingrid Bergman, who was a Hollywood actress, who said happiness is good digestion and bad memory. So that is my favorite definition of it. Okay, my 3 comments on poetry as therapy. The first is, when is poetry therapeutic? I think it is at the bottom of the pit of depression, but only when there is a movement in the psyche towards emergence from that depression, which has already started. At the bottom of the pit, of course, when you are unable even to get off the bed,
JLF at South Bank returns for its third edition from the 21st to the 22nd of May. Catch the conversations, debate and dialogue along the banks of the London Thames. And if you're across the pond, JLF at Bodo will be back for a second year from the 23rd to 25th September.
The annual Jaipur Literature Festival brochure with details on each session, author profiles and photographs. A must-have guide to the festival. This limited edition
story, the poem, the poem that begins to lead and equal to the full complexity of the experience of depression. So to respond to poetry involves an activity of the reader has been able to cope.
JLF at South Bank returns for its third edition from the 21st to the 22nd of May. Catch the conversations, debate and dialogue along the banks of the London Thames. And if you're across the pond, JLF at Bodo will be back for a second year from the 23rd to 25th September.
Not in the food itself. In a similar way, I would say, poetry lies in the meaning of the poet and the reader, not in the lives of...
For the latest information, visit www.jaipurliteraturefestival.org, follow us on Facebook, Twitter and Instagram, or download the Timo Guides app.
The reader recognizes something of
The annual Jaipur Literature Festival brochure with details on each session, author profiles and photographs. A must-have guide to the festival. This limited edition program is a collector's item and is available for sale at ₹100. Pick up your copy now.
That it is therapeutic to sing, and perform, which it is. Any kind of singing, listening, performing is poetry is therapeutic because of unmasked self-discipline and also strengthens our capacity for and all our inside feeling is I think
Bringing the best of jazz, the past, the present and the future together over 2 days of fantastic music. Teamwork Arts and Capital Jazz present the Jazz Utsav. Now in its 31st edition, it is the definitive festival for jazz in Delhi. Lineup today, Woodstock Jazz Band, the future of jazz. Gary Julian and friends, bringing the glorious past of jazz alive with their tunes.
Awareness. So poetry too would have...
And flavor of the current jazz season, Rudresh Mahantapa's Gamak.
Poetry and psychotherapy have in common.
The young Joel Lyciridis and his trio, showing the future of jazz is in good hands.
Feeling are integrated.
Kareem Elabudi and Vasundhara.
Makes it possible for a person to...
Arthur Dudkiewicz trio, featuring the piano legend from Poland. Jazz Utsav 2016 edition will be held on the 19th and the 20th of November, bringing jazz alive for the music-loving audiences.
In other words, to abolish current language, that of empty, amidst private and personal speech, and second, through the form of the poem, its rhythms, alliterations, assonances, the whole texture of sounds and shades of meaning, which make it poetry rather than prose. And the third is, I think you mentioned already, we have a lot of anecdotal evidence. I was quoting Sylvia Plath, but you have Rilke, and in prose Virginia Woolf, all of them saying that poetry contributed as a self-treatment for their depression. But writing poetry may contribute more to therapy than does reading it. So writing poetry may be a form of therapy,
reading poetry can only be therapeutic if there is something in the poetry which takes hold of the reader. And now, can there be poems which take hold of every reader? I would doubt that. Every poem has many meanings because of the richness of its texture and also because of the multiplicity of contexts in which it can be read. So meanings are inevitably different for different people. For the same person, they vary with changes in mood and circumstance. So it is not just a matter of good or poor poetry. What is poor poetry? Poor poetry tells us nothing that we did not already know. But our knowledge of ourselves and the world we live in varies widely, as will what a person finds as a good or a bad poem.
And since you were talking of poems, I'll give you my favorite poem for when I feel low, not completely depressed, which is Robert Frost's poem. And I love its first line. The poem is called Acquainted with the Night. And the first line is absolutely wonderful. I have been one acquainted with the night. I walked out in rain and back in rain. I have outwalked the furthest city light. I have looked down the saddest city lane. I have passed by the watchman on his beat and dropped my eyes, unwilling to explain. I have stood still and stopped the sound of feet when far away an interrupted cry came over houses from another street, but not to call me back or say goodbye. And further still, at an unearthly height, one luminary clock against the sky proclaimed that time was neither wrong nor right. I have been one acquainted with the night. That was my favorite one.
Wonderful.
If everyone
Thank
was
you.
reading it, I thought I'll also read it.
Thank you very much. That was really fascinating points there. I suppose my response, this idea that no one poem speaks to somebody in the same way, to me, that is at the heart of why poetry is so brilliant, is that actually we all bring very different, varied experience, and our mental health is subtle and complicated. So I love the fact that different poems speak to different people. And when I run my workshops for mental health charities, what I find is that I run a 4-week course in an arc from dark to light. So we share poems that describe darkness. We share poems that provide a different story, a different narrative, in the way that George Herbert tells you a different story. We provide poems that talk about connection, both with nature and with others. And finally, the last session is on poems for what Freud called ordinary unhappy life. So poems to get through. And each time we, as a group, we share around 8 or 9 poems. And what I find so rewarding about this work is that, as Sudhir was saying, people respond in different ways. I was working last week with a workshop, and a woman read a poem that was actually not one of the ones we've shared today, but she started to cry as she was reading it, and she said, you know, in 30 years of doctors and nurses and psychotherapists, and nobody has ever better voiced what it is to be me. And she sweetly emailed me, and she said, I keep this poem in my bag at all times now, and I don't feel alone. And I think loneliness is a big component, obviously, and often of depression. Even when we're surrounded by a lot of people, we can feel lonely. So I actually love the sort of variety of responses that poetry evokes, and that's why the work always stays so compelling to me, because everybody responds differently. Which I would love to now open the discussion to the floor, how you respond. It needn't be poetry, perhaps the other arts speak to you. We know that music is probably the quickest mood changer. I talked about poetry as a way of being in the flow, of being in the moment. My friend was saying to me, but I like golf. You know, golf does it for me. I mean, your poetry, forget it. So I'd love to share as a group other ideas. If poetry helps you, in which way it helps you. As Sudhir says, when does it help you? There was a view there that, as Sudhir said, you have to be well enough to connect with the poem. And I agree with that. But also, as I say, it was absolutely transformational when there was nothing else. That line which inspired hope. So are there any questions, or anybody here you'd like to comment, or any questions?
It is already. Oh, okay.
Hi.
You are true.
Sir.
You are very true. It does work. Poetry does work.
Aw.
Work miraculously. All things remind me Alexander Pope. If popes are used, there's a fear of making parts. These two lines help me a lot.
Oh.
And then if you go to Punjabi, Nanak Niwa Jo Chale, Lage Matlabti Wa. These two lines only help me a lot. So you are very true and your approach is excellent. Thank you.
Thank you very much. A clap, please. Thank you. That was wonderful. Thank you for sharing. I hope you noticed how powerful it is, the experience of speaking a poem aloud. And I think that's another very important point in you sharing those two lines. Also that point that it's just two lines. You know, you might not be well enough for a whole poem, but two lines can be so powerful. So thank you very much. Any other questions? Yes.
Excuse me, I agree that poetry works, but how does it work really? Is it the music, it is the rhyme, it is the rhythm, or it is the meaning, or the combination of all these? If it were music alone, then the same thing can be done by a musical composition. If it was meaning alone, then perhaps it would go to the same thing.
Yeah.
So I know actually how does it work?
That's a really, really good question. I think if you look at little children, so you go into a playground and you look at children and they instinctively have a response to rhyme, and they sing chants in the playground. And it's almost like as we grow up, you know, poetry becomes something difficult and we don't really study it at school, and then we don't think it's relevant in our lives. But I think you put your finger on something, there's a very instinctive response to rhyme. And you also started to brilliantly analyse all the different ways it works. And what I would say is you can always take that approach of teasing out the different ways. So whether it's the power of the image, you know, we had that little bird as a symbol of hope in the Emily Dickinson. I mean, what an amazing symbol. When you're feeling hopeless, this little bird that can fly is a very powerful symbol. So it could be a symbol, it could be rhyme, it could be some of the other things you mentioned. And poets spend a huge amount of time trying to connect with us. They use every trick in the book to intensely pack into meaning in a few lines. So they're appealing to everything. They appeal to our senses, alliteration, all the tricks that poets use. And how does it all work? Well, I think there's a certain kind of magic. We can't always understand exactly how it works. Would you like to comment? Yeah.
Well, I think I did say that it is not either or.
Yeah.
The poetry integrates both the thought and the music, or the emotion. Let's put it emotion. So music and words, and thought and emotion. So it is the integrated, it is two in one. One alone would not work. It's two in one, which makes for the force. And that is also, I said, in any kind of psychoanalytic therapy, it is not what is wrong with you. If I tell you it is wrong and you admit it is wrong, true, it's not going to have any kind of a change in your behavior. So most of the counseling fails because of that, because everyone knows what's wrong with me, but it has not grabbed me. The emotion is not. So as long as the emotional awareness is not there, nothing works. So poetry combines both. It has the music, the emotion, and the thought. One alone would not.
Yeah.
Music alone can be completely, then it works, you feel very nice, but that is sentimental. Sentimentality also does not work alone. I mean, sentiment and thought have to be combined, and good poetry does that. Bad poetry can be only sentimental or only thought.
We can just try it out in the room. So I'll just give you a line of poetry and just observe how it's both, as Sudhir brilliantly put it, it is both about the meaning, but it's also about the sound. So this is a line that I used to recite to myself about recovery, and it's a wonderful line. It says, "How my shriveled heart recovered greenness. How my shriveled heart recovered greenness." So that is about the sound, but it's also a very strong message and a meaning. So exactly as he says, the two together, if that makes any sense. Yes. Hi.
I just have two brief comments. One is that your talk so resonated with me
Oh, thank you.
that it really touches the heart.
Oh,
And
thank you.
I know. The second one was, I was just reminded, listening to you, Dr. Salman Akhtar, who is a well-known psychoanalyst and a poet, he compares the two and says that poetry is one person analysis and analysis is two people's poetry.
Wonderful.
Because you listen to the metaphor.
Wonderful, wonderful.
You know, poetry is metaphor and analysis. You don't listen to what's being said. You listen to what is not being said.
Wonderful.
And what the person doesn't know.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. That's really wonderful. Thank you. Thank you.
I'm a caregiver and a special educator. I'd like to take up the point of mindfulness which you mentioned. I will also talk, Dr. Sudhir Kakar mentioned that if the person is deep in the pit, how to get him out, to get to connect. In a family setting, person with illness, poetry helps in many ways. We have a system of the Helia in India. Sudhir mentioned this. The family setting, the person with depression is also there, others are also there, the very physical areas. So, as a simple poet, a heavy line, Hariti, Joshala, or what happens? The word goes around. I doubt what this symbolizes. What is it talking about? The person with illness, at some time, the mindfulness will come up and will, he's intelligent enough to figure out what this is and he'll give up the right answer. He'll pick up in a number of ways, he'll come up with the right answer. And this brings him out from the aloofness, the loneliness, the connects. The connectedness is so important to get out of this. These are small poetries and these are games to play. And we also do it. And we have to do it because this triggers off that mindfulness within the person who's amongst us. And then Antyakshari is another way of getting people out. They suddenly come up with the next connect poetry when we play these games.
Okay.
The biggest, the simplest poetry is just
Lovely,
so
yeah.
I think if you could, Sudhir would also like to comment on this.
Yeah, just briefly, and I'll pass to Sudhir. One of the points you raised, which I think is very, very important, is that point that somebody has found their own answer. And that in itself, of course, is incredibly healing, because the more we're told what to do by others, or we're given drugs, or something is imposed on top of us, we know that is much less effective than finding our own answer and our own truth. So I love that point you made that poetry can be a way that we can find our own words and our own answer. So I'll pass to Sudhir on that one.
Well, I think one of you were talking at the right, at the pits of depression. I mean, in the training as psychoanalysts, when you're trained, you're asked, what do you do when one person is suicidal? And the first thing kind of the crisis intervention is, who would suffer, who would cry, if you kill yourself or kill yourself. So that is important to set up in the psyche of connections. Someone is going to mourn with me, my mother, etc. That's the most important, because in depression you come completely closed. The world is dark, hopeless, people are not there. So the first thing you are trained to it would be terrible if the person says no one, because then you don't know. Because then you say, but what about me? I mean, that is what the analyst does. It is how to start the connection with the world outside, with the persons. So that is very, very important does poetry, as I said, after that, I think poetry does it, because at that time you don't want to read poetry. I mean, everything is, you become very, very cynical. I've seen people who used to love poetry, and in the depths of depression, calling it, I think, quoting Somerset Maugham, opium of the intelligentsia. That is what poetry is. So, I mean, kind of denigration, just to
the people are absolutely romanticizing romantic. So you have to, so there only the important thing is to create in the mind at least connection to someone who is going to suffer, etc. And if poetry helps us to change our response, I mean that is what it is supposed to be doing, because it shows us very clearly what our responses are. I mean, it shows you clearly what your response is. That's how you start changing your response.
Yeah. I think that's beautifully put. I mean, what I would add, something we haven't touched on, is actually funny poetry. You know, sometimes a funny poem can be very helpful as well, because if you think about it, back to mindfulness and being in the moment and not engaging in that characteristic of depressive thinking, which is worrying about the future or regretting the past. If you think about it, when we laugh, we're most in the moment. So I'll just try one. I hope nobody here is Welsh.
Let's hear from a poet. Sudeep Sen is sitting there and he's raising his hand. Sudeep.
Okay, should I just finish this funny poem? Just to experience it as a group, because what I'm trying to keep coming back to is how we experience things in the moment. So this is a poem, it's written by Christopher Logue, and it's for the man in search of rural seclusion. And the poem goes like this: when all else fails, try Wales. Okay, so I hope you were in the moment in that second. Thank you.
Kerry, I was very intrigued to hear your presentation. It reminded me of a particular book which you probably have read called The Fire Within.
Right.
It's all about poets, and it's a book that's been written by an ex-depressed person who has a PhD and who now practices clinical science and psychology. I want to just flip it the other way. In that book, there were lots of drafts and in the appendix there were these log frames where they showed that the highest cases of depression and so on occur in poets.
Right.
Why is that? I know that perhaps out of, because many of my colleagues and friends are all poets, but tell me the scientific side to it. Why is it? I mean, the book has been thrown to research, and every chapter in fact begins with epigraph, beautiful epigraph from various poets. I'm just curious.
Well, we haven't really talked about it here today, but you're absolutely right. There's a whole other discussion to be had about the actual process of writing poetry. And you're also right that in terms of sort of evidence of what works or what doesn't work, there's been much more work done on about the therapeutic power of writing things down. Your comment about it's shown that poets tend to have a greater susceptibility to depression, and I'm sure we could all reel off a quick run of names of famous poets who have suffered for depression. I think it then becomes part of a much bigger discussion, which I wouldn't limit to poets. I would say let's look at musicians, let's look at artists, all creative talent to a certain extent, I'd say, and it's probably a generality, and I'd love to hear what others think, is there is something about going very deep and going much deeper. And I think we know that, when we're happy and, on the surface of life, we don't feel that kind of necessity to create possibly in quite the same way. But these are very generalized comments. I don't know what Sudhir would say.
Yeah, I have two answers to it. First of all, Sudeep, I think there's a very much cultural part to this. In Western culture, right from Plato onwards, it was poets and madness were connected together. And in the Middle Ages, it changed to melancholia. When you look at Dürer's painting, which is the one for melancholy, where he is, the very famous one, sitting like that. That melancholia and creativity became combined in Western, so that was for a long time. So it is a very much a Western one, that first the madness and creativity, poetry are combined, then depression. And this is not true of Indian poetic, etc., where the poet is supposed to be the sanest of the person and very balanced, who's neither this way nor, and that is in Western art too, that the artist is excessive, has to be excessive, and also the poet part of it. So I think one is, it is following a cultural script that you expected that to be. And the second part, I think the more universal part is that poets or all creative people, I think are are much more in touch with reality, and reality is depressive. I mean, reality, if you are not a complete optimist, is not a great thing. And that's why I think the two, to me, individuals who have the greatest insights into human mind are Buddha and Freud, who were both depressive. I mean, Buddha's Sarvam Dukkham is a depressive statement to do. So depressives have a much greater touch with reality. In psychoanalysis, you say, Melanie Klein's thing, etc., that we are all born as paranoids, and it is a great maturity to become a depressive.
Fantastic.
Thank you. I've been bubbling to ask a question. I believe as a writer, as a poet, I face a certain dichotomy when it comes to reproducing a character and detaching myself from the character and writing about the character. So do you face the same? And I don't know which is the perfect style of writing. I mean, I'm probably like an amateur, but I would want to know what is your personal style, what you believe in writing that.
As a writer, my style as a writer, well, the first thing to say is I'm not a poet, so I'm on the kind of consumer end as opposed to writing of poetry. My experience is writing a memoir. That is a big topic. It is interesting to look at memories and what we remember, which is not always accurate. I was very lucky. I've always kept diaries. I've always written. You heard I was a journalist, so I've never not written. So when I was trying to recreate my story of what happened to me in my journey from very severe depression to recovery, I returned to written evidence. So I had my own diaries, I had letters, I had my doctor's notes, and I asked people who looked after me and who knew me at the time for their memories. And the thing, I won't talk too long on this, but what really struck me was that my own memories were often completely wrong. Or rephrase that, they weren't wrong, they were how I had experienced something and how I remembered it. But people around me had remembered it in a very different way. I'll give you a very brief example of that. One of the stresses that brought on my depression was trying to work as well as have small children. And I did get better and I did go on, and I didn't think I'd be unwell again. So I was keen to have another child, and I assumed I wouldn't be unwell. And I remember ringing my husband from the doctors and saying, I'm pregnant. And he was taken aback, and he had to leave work. He said, you never told me. I said, well, what do you mean? I'm sure I discussed it with you. And he said, no, you didn't discuss it with me. So when I first wrote the book, I wrote this whole chapter about how I discussed with my husband, we'd take the risk, I wouldn't be ill, we'd have another child. And he said, no, it wasn't like that at all. So it's very interesting how memory plays around. And I think in that sense, memoir is a great challenge as a way of writing. And I can't really speak about writing about poetry because it's not something I've done. But maybe Sudhir wants to add something.
Thank you very much, Rachel. We have to close the session. The time is up. And thank you very much for writing this memoir, because it's not only courageous, it is extremely important for people to read the memoir.
And to use a paradox, you have brought depression alive. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Wish to thank us